like to welcome everyone to the second panel of the Schiller Institute conference. There can be no peace without the bankruptcy reorganization of the dying transatlantic financial system. I'm Harley Schlanger, and I'll be the moderator for the second panel. For those unfamiliar with the spiritual you just heard, it is in keeping with the idea in Helga Zepp-LaRouche's presentation or keynote in the first panel about mission impossible. You have to have the optimism to keep going ahead, even if things seem to be going against you, because there's no alternative for humanity except for the good people to keep fighting. For those just joining us, the first panel featured an intense discussion among representatives of many nations on why a new security architecture is a necessary precondition for a peaceful future. That is, putting an end to the dangerous fallacy that peace depends on nations submitting to the arbitrary rules of a unipolar order. If you missed it, that panel will be archived at the website of the Schiller Institute. Our second panel is titled Runaway Inflation or Glass-Steagall. I think it's become obvious to many that the present global economic policy of subordinating national economies to the demands of the parasites running global financial and corporate cartels has put millions of lives at risk, from the effects of inflation, the breakdown of the physical economic production, and the failure to invest in a platform of modern infrastructure. The visible panic among politicians of all parties, of those who run the cartels and the talking heads in the mainstream media, demonstrates that they have no solutions except war and killer austerity. In other words, an escalation of the failed policies that brought us to this conjuncture. But we have a solution. To open this panel, we will have a clip of a presentation from Lyndon LaRouche addressing a webcast on September 4th, 1994, on credit and banking. Toward the end of this clip, there'll be a moment where you lose the visual, but he will continue speaking, so stay with us.
The problem we are about to face, and we already face implicitly, most people are bankrupt today. Most people's savings and pensions are gone, or they are, if we examine the process, they are implicitly gone. Now, in terms of government, or my advice to the United States government and other governments, I say, they're going to say, what am I going to do? I said, you're going to meet the pensions, the pension payments as they come due. And they say, how can we do that? If you say we're bankrupt, how are we going to do that? We're going to pay them anyway. And what we're going to do is this, is we're going to generate fiat money. Under the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, the power of the Congress and the monopoly under our Constitution of the power of Congress to create money. That money will not be spent by the government directly. It will not be money you print to buy. It will be money you print to loan. So we are going to loan to selected projects in a dirigistic, you might say, Gaullist way, the way de Gaulle did somewhat. We're going to loan the money where it's needed. We're going to reorganize financial institutions, including pension funds, so the pension funds are going to get a new source of income. We're going to do that by recycling through the growth of the economy as a whole. We are going to do that largely through large-scale public works projects, which in the case of the United States will involve trillions of dollars of projects. For example, we need a new rail system. I say the United States needs a magnetic levitation rail system, coast to coast, and we need to increase the depth so that every community is served. And this all goes for Canada as well. It goes also for the Middle East, but let's take just the United States as an example to illustrate the problem I'm discussing. We need an inland waterway system. Our inland waterway system has gone to pot. The Erie Canal should be functioning. Otherwise, the function for which the Erie Canal was created is still needed. You still need economical barge traffic into central New York if central New York is to function efficiently, as well as an efficient rail system. You need to bring the communities of the United States back into competitive economic functioning, like the rural communities or the quasi-rural communities, which are now collapsing and have been collapsing since the beginning of deregulation in 1978, 1979, especially after the Volcker measures. So we have to do that. We're going to have to rebuild the Mississippi and the entire water system. We have water potential or growth potential in the western United States, but the land is not usable because the aquifers are collapsing and we don't have enough water. We have enough water in Canada. It's silly to move water from the central United States, where you have these quasi-desertified regions, from the Colorado Basin into Los Angeles. Can you think of anything more idiotic than taking fresh water from Utah and the Colorado Basin to feed the water requirements of Los Angeles? If those bums want fresh water, let them desalinate. They've got a Pacific Ocean right out there. Do you realize that this country has not built a new city since before World War I, to speak of, except Los Alamos and a few places like that? We've got all that land out there that's not developed. We've got potential agricultural land and reserve land for the future of our children, where they need that land. To have it developed, to make it reserve land, to forest it, to put cover on it, to get some water in there, to create new cities, to develop this country which is underdeveloped. We have a need. We talked about hospitals. We need a hospital system according to Hill-Burton standards, which delivers what is needed in terms of health care facilities to every part of this United States. We're talking about trillions of dollars of work to be done and no savings to buy it with, at a time when savings are wiped out. So we're going to have to create a money system from scratch, and there's nobody to loan money. The government will have to generate the cash, take over the banks, because they're all bankrupt, force the bankers to stay functioning there, or we'll get a farmer to take over the place of the banker to... Get the credit out, give the credit to whoever has a state, federal, local authority which is approved project, to get the credit, to meet the payroll, to buy the materials, to get the capital equipment, to get the project going, just like a war contract. Then the private contractors who come in and get accepted bids on the basis they think they can perform, let the local bankers, local officials decide. They come into a bank with a contract. They've got a contract. We will have the bank guaranteed by the national banking system of the United States. We'll deliver the credit to cover the payrolls on time, to cover the materials bills on time, and to buy the authorized equipment they need to do the job. On the basis we are going to generate credit. Now, at the point we do that through the national bank, then the kind of talking about then comes into play. Then you want people who are going to be as entrepreneurs, set up under federal regulation or state charters to set up banks or to reopen banks that are closing, to take them over, to run them on the basis of saying, we have a covenant under which this thing is going to operate and it's going to perform this way.
For those of you just joining us, this is our second panel of the Schiller Institute conference on the topic Runaway Inflation or Glass-Steagall. What you just saw was a presentation by the economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche in 1994. The reorganization Mr. LaRouche was discussing then is more urgent now than ever, as the everything bubble built up since 2008 is imploding. Opening our panel will be a keynote from Diane Sare. Diane, who you saw conducting the Schiller chorus in that opening musical offering, is now a certified candidate for U.S. Senate from New York State, having led a drive to get 45,000 petition signatures to put her on the ballot. She succeeded. That's a first step toward mission impossible. In the interest of fairness, we invited her opponent, Senator Charles Schumer, the senator from Wall Street, to address this conference, but we never heard back from him. Diane will be speaking on the topic, the collapse of the West and the urgent need to join the Belt and Road Initiative. Diane?
Thank you, Harley. Can the United States be brought to shift its current trajectory of self and global annihilation on behalf of the bankrupt Anglo-Dutch imperial order to instead join the new paradigm of cooperation and development which is currently being led by Russia and China? This is the burning question which the prophetic Lyndon LaRouche was asking throughout the 1990s, and which has been raised again by Helga Zepp-LaRouche at the May 26th conference of the Schiller Institute. The insanity of politicians threatens nuclear war. The answer to that question must be yes, or it is very hard to imagine how we are going to survive even in the short term, let alone for generations to come. First of all, we must remind ourselves, what is the United States? We're on the cusp of the 250th anniversary of our founding, but if George Washington and Alexander Hamilton were to visit us today, they would wonder how we had allowed ourselves to be so thoroughly taken over by the British Empire. In his November 2004 paper, The Coming Eurasian World Toward a Second Treaty of Westphalia, LaRouche wrote, "Was it necessary for Americans to go so far in resisting the recently spawned British Empire as to think of a warlike break to independence from that cruel empire?" The answer, as experience affirmed that view, was that not only was the revolutionary independence of the English colonies in North America justified, as the U.S. Declaration of Independence avows, it was necessary for the sake of the liberation of Europe's nations from the ultimately fatal corruption of which Europe could not otherwise cure itself. The creation of our new republic must be the adoption of the best from Europe, but the best freed from the fatal corruption of the existing institutionalized culture of Europe. This was implicitly the same corroborating observation made by Friedrich Schiller in viewing the horrors of the French Revolution. A great historic opportunity had been lost because the moment had found a people morally too small-minded to seize that long-awaited opportunity when it had been presented. What should have happened in France in 1789 was realized by the role of the USA under President Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt led in freeing a Europe which had brought the blight of the Jacobin terror and Napoleon upon itself earlier, and fascism much more recently, through its own continuing cultural political corruption. Today, the same logic says, we must free our USA from its present seizure by the infection of a fatal corruption like that which afflicted Europe in the two so-called world wars and the rise of fascism in the past, that we might once again take that action which would save our republic from its own present lunacy, while also saving Europe from its own present folly. How does a nation achieve actual independence? Not merely declared liberation as from the British Empire. If your people are starving and sickly, dying before the age of 40, are you free? If 100,000 of your citizens die in 1 year of drug overdoses, while 1 million more die over 2 years of a pandemic virus, is that freedom? Is committing suicide and/or genocide among the unalienable rights referred to by our founders? Was a costly revolution fought against the leading imperial power of the world, the British Empire, in order for us and others around the world to have short Miserable lives? Obviously not. In order to uphold the principles expressed in the creation of this republic, a system of physical and political economy had to be developed which would allow people to live longer, healthier, and happier lives. Thanks to the genius of Alexander Hamilton and his collaborators and a relative handful of great presidents, our nation managed, in spite of some rotten characters, to achieve that goal in fits and starts until the assassination of President Kennedy. From that point on, with very few limited exceptions, our nation has abandoned the policies and outlook which led to our success and instead embraced the agenda of a decadent and dying British Empire. The key to a successful economy and a free nation is a commitment to increasing man's power over nature, creating our own environment with modern housing, sanitation, transportation, heat in the winter, indoor plumbing, reliable food production, which is increased with water management and fertilization and refrigeration to prolong storage, all of which require abundant sources of energy. This is the key to making each of us more productive. While there are many complex and interrelated factors that go into this, not the least of which is the concept of public credit, what I want to focus on in this limited time is 4 great initiatives which transform the standard of living and thus increase the freedom of the American people, so that you can see why joining China's Belt and Road Initiative would be the most natural and American response to the crisis we currently face. Number 1, the Erie Canal, which was first proposed by New Yorker Gouverneur Morris in 1777, and it was the subject of great controversy. It finally was begun in 1817 on the 4th of July, and it was completed 8 years later on the 4th of July in 1825. Look at the capstone for the Buffalo area lock. Let posterity be excited to perpetuate our free institutions and to make still greater efforts than our ancestors to promote public prosperity by the recollection that these works of internal improvement were achieved by the spirit and perseverance of Republican free men. Republican, although capitalized in the lock, means Republican with a small r, not the party per se. Look at the cities shown here along the route of the Erie Canal and consider how building this canal transformed not merely New York State, but the entire nation. Second, we will take the Transcontinental Railroad. And I'm going to share with you a speech from President Abraham Lincoln as a young man on the discoveries and inventions. He says, "We have all heard of young America. He is the most current youth of the age. Some think him conceited and arrogant. But has he not reason to entertain a rather extensive opinion of himself? Is he not the inventor and owner of the present and sole hope of the future? Men and things everywhere are ministering unto him. Look at his apparel, and you shall see cotton fabrics from Manchester and Lowell, flax linen from Ireland, wool cloth from Spain, silk from France, furs from the Arctic regions, with a buffalo robe from the Rocky Mountains, as a general outsider. At his table, besides plain bread and meat made at home, are sugar from Louisiana, coffee and fruits from the tropics, salt from Turk's Island, fish from Newfoundland, tea from China, and spices from the Indies. The whale of the Pacific furnishes his candlelight. He has a diamond ring from Brazil, a gold watch from California, and a Spanish cigar from Havana. He has not only a present supply of all of these and much more, but thousands of hands are engaged in producing fresh supplies and other thousands in bringing them to him. The iron horse is panting and impatient to carry him everywhere in no time, and the lightning stands ready harnessed to take and bring his tidings in a trifle less than no time. So the development of rail changed the world. Now, just one example of some of the extraordinary breakthroughs required to build the Transcontinental Railroad is the Dale Creek Bridge in Wyoming. I also will add here, without dwelling on it, but everyone should know that 15 to 20,000 Chinese immigrant workers were involved in the construction of this railroad in some of the most difficult places. Now we move on to number 3, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was built in one of the most impoverished parts of the United States during the Great Depression, thanks to the unharnessed and unregulated power of the Tennessee River. You had malaria, terrible soil erosion, people were illiterate, but the region became transformed to be one of the most productive areas on the face of the earth. In his first chapter of his book, Democracy on the March, David Lilienthal, who was the director of the Tennessee Valley Authority, wrote, "All of this could have happened in almost any of 1,000 other valleys where the rivers run from the hills to the sea. For the valleys of the earth have these things in common: the waters, the air, the land, the minerals, the forests. In Missouri and Arkansas, in Brazil and in the Argentine, in China and in India, there are just such rivers. Rivers that in the violence of flood menace the land and the people. Then sulken idleness and drought. Rivers all over the world waiting to be controlled by men. Fields, slopes, forests, minerals that can be made to yield a better living for people." And finally, number 4, the Apollo mission, which I would prefer to think of as a transportation corridor into space, although also people think of it as a science driver because of all of the breakthroughs required to do it and the benefits reaped by our economy on Earth. But it should really be thought as a corridor of expansion into the universe, just as a railroad or a canal or a river. After all, as Kraft Erica said, if God had wanted man to be a spacefaring species, he would have given him a moon. In 1963, Kennedy was assassinated, and so were Malcolm X in 1965, Martin Luther King in 68, and Kennedy's younger brother, Robert, also in 1968, who was about to become president of the United States. Although we managed to make it to the moon in 1969, already by 1967, the last 3 Apollo moon missions were scrapped, and our national identity shifted from one of optimism to a dark, drug-laced pessimism. Lyndon LaRouche warned about the rock, drug, sex counterculture and the anti-human green movement associated with it, but terrified and corrupt political leaders capitulated to the treasonous pro-British ideology of our misnamed intelligence agencies and State Departments, which gave us the Vietnam War and a series of forever wars. The fact that Lyndon LaRouche was incarcerated by these very networks, as opposed to being allowed to lead the nation as president, indicated just how far we had fallen. The commitment to transforming nature for the good of humanity has shifted to other nations, and now China is leading the way with its Belt and Road Initiative. Before I get to the whole project, I would like to make a short detour with one Chinese project done with also inspiration from the United States, specifically the TVA. This is the Three Gorges Dam. This project, which holds back so much water that motion in the reservoir and filling the reservoir actually slowed the rotation of the Earth, I think by 6/100ths of a second in a year, was the result of a continual process of dialogue between the American and Chinese visionaries. The destructive power of the unbridled Yangtze River had been known for centuries already. And in 1919, Sun Yat-sen had proposed that a dam should be built at that location. After David Lilienthal's book was published about the TVA in 1944, it was translated into many languages, including Chinese. By 1945, 50,000 copies of the book were circulating in China, but Lilienthal himself had been discussing this frequently with the Chinese ambassador to the U.S. going as far back as 1939. The dam began producing electricity in 2003. So when did it become American policy to crush other nations as opposed to celebrate progress of human beings anywhere on the planet? In 1996, Helga Zepp-LaRouche traveled to Beijing to present a proposal for a new Silk Road. And a report was released which included this illustration. In 2013, President Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, which is now building so many huge projects in so many nations, it's impossible to even scratch the surface here. This is just from their website, the Belt and Road Initiative, and I'll just tell you some of the corridors you see here, 6 of them. 1 is the New Eurasian Land Bridge Economic Corridor. 2 is China, Mongolia, Russia Economic Corridor. 3 is China, Central Asia, West Asia Economic Corridor. 4 is China, Indochina Peninsula Economic Corridor. 5 is Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar, and 6 is CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Also, you can see a maritime Silk Road and a polar Silk Road, which thanks to the warming at the North Pole will become a new transportation route. Now, I'm just going to show you a few images very, very fast from the 2018 Belt and Road Conference list of 35 projects. So the first one we're going to see is the Djibouti-Addis Ababa corridor. That's in Ethiopia, so you see the rail there and the train, a picture of their train. Their trains probably go faster than they do in the United States these days. Next is Lapset, which is a project from Lamu Port in Kenya to southern Sudan. This thing is really huge. I couldn't find copyright-free images of the Lamu port, so I suggest you go and look it up, but it's amazing. I think it has 3 separate ports depending on what you're shipping, importing, exporting, etc. Modern, beautiful. Now, CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, with a modernized Gwadar port. You can see by the arrows there how this goes directly from the port into China, and obviously Pakistan is a major bordering country of Afghanistan. This will be very important to facilitate the development of Afghanistan. Then we just heard in the last days a new corridor which, thanks to the stupid suicidal sanctions of NATO, Biden, and the UK, Russia is not trading with nations that are under these sanctions that we are imposing supposedly on Russia but are hurting us. So they have a new corridor, as you can see, through Iran to India, and it reduces the travel time, which would normally by that blue line take 40 days down to 25 days, and they just shipped their first test shipment through this corridor. So now here's a map of the world as I imagine people from China and Russia see it. The United States is a giant black hole. Everything stops here. It's a giant pit sucking in the world's wealth. quite literally, since we stole the money from the Afghan central bank, now we're trying to figure out how to steal $300 billion from Russia, but at the same time we don't want everyone to leave the dollar, so it's a really tricky question how to continue stealing but have people trust you. Now here's the question. Are we benefiting from destroying everyone else or trying to destroy them? No. As I said, we had 1 million COVID deaths, 100,000 drug overdose deaths. We're having mass shootings, power outages, floods, and fires. I just read a paper recently which talks about how people underestimate the problem of stupidity, and this particular author distinguishes stupidity from banditry by defining stupidity as hurting yourself while also hurting others. He says bandits hurt others but they gain for themselves. Stupid people or nations hurt others and also destroy themselves. So let's stop being stupid. In closing, I wanted to give you a few ideas very briefly. The number one question for increasing economic growth is energy flux density. That is, producing more energy and consuming more energy per given area, but also per weight, per mass of fuel. That's why the fourth of LaRouche's 4 laws is a crash program to develop a fusion energy platform, which you can't get to without crushing Wall Street and the City of London with Glass-Steagall and a national bank and credit policy. We also need to join the major powers, namely Russia, China, and India, to return to fixed exchange rates. No more gambling with currencies. Now, here's my idea. If you look at the Chinese Belt and Road, it's based on what they call connectivity, that is, corridors of transportation by land and sea. Think of the decrepit state of America's cities. Where are these cities? Aren't nearly all of them ports, either on rivers or coastlines or man-made transport corridors like railroads? Think about them. Buffalo, Baltimore, Houston, San Diego, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Boston, Trenton, Detroit, Newark. What would it mean for the United States to join the Belt and Road? All of these cities would have to be modernized. The ports would have to be modernized. Some have been quietly by the Chinese, but we need high-speed rail, about 42,000 miles of it. We need highways without potholes. We need massive amounts of energy to power doing all of this, probably several hundred nuclear power plants. What about hydroelectricity and water management? Is it necessary to have perpetual droughts and floods? Aren't we the nation that built the TVA? We need to finally build the North American Water and Power Alliance, NWAPA, just that one continent-wide project besides totally transforming the climate of the United States would create 14 million jobs. And finally, what's the point of modernizing the Long Island Railroad and building a maglev train to Buffalo if we don't intend to travel on to our partners in St. Petersburg? So we cannot forget the Bering Strait Tunnel, which would finally link us by rail to Eurasia, as opposed to considering that our best allies are over in the British Isles, as our dear friends Hal Cooper and Lyndon LaRouche intended. Would Americans be interested in reclaiming our true identity as a force for goodness in the world? I think so. We have a huge job to do very quickly in reminding ourselves and our neighbors who we are.
Thank you, Diane. Diane will be joining us for questions after the panel. And if you have questions, send them in to questions@schillerinstitute.org. Our next speaker is Daisuke Kotegawa. He's the former Japanese finance ministry official and an executive director for Japan at the International Monetary Fund. And he's chosen a provocative and legitimate title for his presentation: "Don't Let This World Be Destroyed by Filthy Gamblers Who who call themselves Wall Street and City of London bankers. Mr. Kotegawa?
I think today I'd like to say, don't let this world be destroyed by filthy gamblers who call themselves Wall Street and City of London bankers. First, in 1985, Japan and the United States agreed upon the so-called Plaza Accord, a coordinated foreign exchange intervention to appreciate the yen. At the Plaza Hotel in New York, in order to correct the US trade deficit with Japan, the yen immediately doubled from the level before the, agreement. As a result, labor costs in Japan doubled, and Japanese companies, which could no longer compete internationally, moved their factories to Southeast Asia and China, where labor costs were cheaper. As a result of these factory relocations of Japanese companies, one of the centers of world production have shifted to these regions. Labor costs in these regions have risen gradually, people's incomes have risen, and the so-called flying geese pattern of development has been achieved. The stronger yen had another important effect. Japanese financial institutions started to penetrate the London financial market against the backdrop of a stronger yen. As a result, the exorbitant profit margins that had formed the basis of London's commercial banks, which had long sat in the privileged positions, fell to 1/10 in a short period of time, and financial institutions with long traditions such as S.G. Wilbur went bankrupt. Negotiations were held in Basel to stop such Japanese financial institutions, and the so-called Basel Rule were agreed in 1988. At the end of the 1990s, Southeast Asian countries and Japan faced the problem of non-performing loans stemming from the Basel regulations. Consequently, the Asian economic crisis and the Japanese financial crisis led the manufacturing industry in these regions to stagnation. Only China was able to survive in such crisis, and since the beginning of this century, China has become the center of the world's manufacturing industry, and the concern about the challenge of China has emerged in the United States. Since the Asian crisis, the world's manufacturing industry has stagnated, and with the complete repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999, investment banks and commercial banks have merged, and investment banks have been transformed into gambling finance, such as high-risk derivatives based upon deposits collected by commercial banks. The Lehman shock in 2008 was the result of such gambling finance. However, the governments of the United States and the United Kingdom did not dispose of their bankruptcies in accordance with the Basel rules, which they demanded of Asian countries, and used tax money to bail out financial institutions. In addition, not only financial institutions, but also large corporations such as General Motors were bailed out using tax money. This is not different from state capitalism, which the West criticized for the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Asian countries were dismayed by such a double standard when they were forced to respond painfully in the event of an Asian crisis. They've had serious doubts about the Western-led international financial order. As a result of the bailout, the financial statements of financial institutions and large corporations were cleaned up at the expense of the state, while the gap between the rich and the poor in society widened, as many employees lost their jobs or switched from regular employment to part-timers. While in the developments of the manufacturing industry, as in the case of Asia, people at lower labor costs are preferentially hired, and they help raise wages and thus improve the lives of the poor, whereas financial capitalism only enriches the rich further. The resulting gap between the rich and the poor has sparked electoral revolts in the West since 2016. On the other hand, the bailout financial institutions became more convinced that the government would bail out depositors in the event of crisis, and they pushed further forward to gambling finance without reflecting upon the mistakes they made on gambling finance. Financial institutions have forgotten their original role of helping to promote industry by lending to the manufacturing industry, and have indulged in gambling between financial institutions. Governments in advanced economies have been conducting unprecedented quantitative easing to conceal the reality of such financial institutions, but in Europe and the United States, funds are not directed toward manufacturing. To further cover up this situation, green finance was allocated, in which any target company defined as green could be provided any amount of money. But due to the failure of the environmental summit in Glasgow, this attempt is also failing. Wall Street and City of London are on the brink of bankruptcy. Europe, which has also increased its reliance on unreliable renewable energy due to a forced environmental movement, began to see a sharp rise in natural gas and other energy prices in the wake of the harsh winter of late 2020 and early 2021. This began to affect agricultural commodity prices. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 and the accompanying sanctions have fueled this trend, and the standard of living of ordinary people in the West is facing severe inflation for the first time in half a century. In this situation, what we need to pay the most attention to in the short term is not the way the Russians and Chinese government comes out. Rather, it is a movement by forces that are expected to go bankrupt under the imminent circumstances described above to obscure all problems through war. The author worked at the core of the Japanese government in the 1990s and had experiences in resolving all the problems with China and North Korea that existed at the time under the table. Based on this experience, the biggest question I have about the Russian invasion of Ukraine is why the US government has not been able to resolve this issue through discussions behind the scenes. If the decline in the quality of government officials cannot be blamed, it is difficult to deny the conclusion that the Biden administration may have wanted war. I believe that now is the time for the United States to return to the starting point of democracy and seek a change of government by voting for the sake of real national interest, not for the benefit of a few. as the United States taught us in Japan, a defeated country after the war. After the end of the Cold War, the world became one polar world. We have no choice but to follow the actions of the United States. And from this perspective, the US agenda will determine the fate of all mankind, and it is my sincere hope that the American people will return to the founding spirit that stood up against British colonialism and choose the right path. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kotegawa. I have a correction to make on where to send your questions. It's questions@schillerinstitute.com. And we will have, hopefully, an extensive discussion period, so make sure you send your questions in when you get a chance. Now I see it says .org up there, but I was just informed that it's .com. Try both of them. Our next speaker is Dr. Uwe Behrens from Berlin, Germany. He's a logistics manager and an author. The title of his presentation is The Non-Rival Doctrine. Dr. Behrens?
The non-rival policy of the USA. In May 2022, finally, the High Commissioner of the UN Human Rights Commission, Mrs. Michelle Bachelet, and her team could visit in China the Xinjiang province, the home of the Chinese Muslim minority, the Uyghurs. She held talks with the officials of the province, with the peoples on the street, visited prison, vocational training camps, schools, hospitals, factories, and workshops. After the 4 days traveling in the province, she returned to Guangzhou, where she replied to the question of the international press. She pointed out to understand the anti-terror action of China on one side to improve the living condition of the entire population, including the Muslim minority, in order to try out the ground of terrorism, and on the other side, to tighten the security measures. The visit was not an investigation, but gave the possibility to talk with the people and the authorities. With this outcome, she did not match the expectation of the anti-China politics in the West. For this, the Western media launched again a campaign by claiming a whistleblower sent the internal files of the Xinjiang police to the well-known but doubtful evangelist scientist Andrea Zenz, the so-called Xinjiang police files. I was looking into the files and must realize all the files are at least 4 to 5 years old. The photos of the police ready to shoot to escaping inmates are out of the internal Chinese police training material, and the text, which was published by the BBC, was written with a software for writing Chinese language, and this software is not in use in China but abroad. The English translation of the original files are misleading and changed partly the meaning completely. For example, in the copied speech of the Xinjiang party leader, he referred to an actual case that one prisoner could escape since the guards did not use their arms. They did not shoot, but they should have done it. The translation indicates the guards must shoot in any case, but the special case this Xinjiang leader mentioned was not mentioned in the translation. All this supports the thus position the files are misleading or even fake. For the anti-Chinese China politics, it is not important that those files are fake. Important for them is only that the people in the Western countries believe it, and the trip of Michelle Bachelet can be criticized. What all this has to do with the non-rival doctrine of the USA. After the Second World War, the USA achieved to be the dominating power in the world, ruling the international relationships worldwide, within the UN, the World Bank, the IMF. The only challenger in that time was the Soviet Union, jointly with the Warsaw Pact states. Already in 1946, the US diplomat George Kennan formulated the strategy for the Cold War against the Soviet Union, the so-called long telegram. By 1990, the US finally succeeded. The Soviet Union was dissolved. Mr. Fukuyama blew the trumpet. The end of the history is reached. In 1993, the US Vice President Dick Cheney published the non-rival doctrine. Never again any power shall be as strong as the Soviet Union to challenge the hegemony of the USA. But in 2001, the Russian President Putin proposed to Germany and the EU to combine the German technology with the Russian resources. Eurasia would be an area in peace and strong to develop the livelihood for its people. But exact this, the USA didn't want. A new strong power which could be a challenge for the American hegemony. Mr. Brzezinski wrote in his several books, the Ukraine would be the key to divide Europe and Russia. In 2004, the Colored Revolution was financed by the USA. In 2014, the Maidan Revolution. The intention to extend the NATO onto the Russian borders followed. Russia finally secured its military safety, the security of the Russian people living in the Ukraine, and acted with arms. Mission completed. Russia and Europe are no rivals anymore. In 2021, the Atlantic Council formulated the so-called longer telegram, the strategy how to contain China. It works out today on three levels: militarily, economically, and politically, respective ideologically. Militarily, the US formed the so-called Quad, one alliance between USA, Japan, Australia, and India. They will deliver nuclear submarines to Australia to form the so-called AUKUS, and the permanent presence of the US Navy in the South China Sea. Economically, trading restriction as tariffs, embargoes, and sanctions against certain goods, forming an economic alliance against China, the new alliance Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Just 2 weeks ago, he launched it in Japan. And this, politically, ideologically, to focus on the fault lines among Xi and his inner circle aiming at changing their strategy course to support Taiwan to claim for independence from China. It means to divide China, or to support the political activists claiming more democracy through independence of Hong Kong from the People's Republic of China. And finally, blaming China for human rights violation in Xinjiang. And this is the chain link between the Xinjiang police files, the visit of Michelle Bachelet, and the non-rival doctrine. China is challenging the hegemony or the hegemonial power of the USA. Now, China is the only rival for the USA for the next coming years. At the moment, I think, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is most probably only the foreplay for the coming conflict between USA and China. And this coming conflict has to be prevented. All the facts, the longer telegram, the non-rival doctrine, and the long telegram, the non-rival doctrine, and the longer telegram of the Atlantic Council are published and available in the internet. But unfortunately, nobody is looking into it. Nobody look on this connection of all this. Instead, everybody is believing the misleading information, half-truths, and even fakes of the main media. The Xinjiang police files are just one part of this strategy to contain China. It is highly important to inform about the outspoken politics of the USA and the NATO and their intention. We have to stop any those further escalation. And this finally begins with those conferences the Schiller Institute organize. For this, I thank the Schiller Institute. Thank you very much.
Well, and thank you, Dr. Behrens, for your presentation. I finally got the confirmation. Questions go to questions@schillerinstitute.org. So I'm sorry for any confusion that we had. And we'll have a question and answer session at the end of the presentations. Our next presentation is from Nino Galloni, who's an economist from Italy, former Director General of the Italian Labor Ministry, and he writes quite frequently on economic policies in the Eurozone and in the West. Nino?
Cara Helga, buonasera a te e a tutti quanti I nostri amici.
Dear Helga, good evening to you and all our friends. In the past years, globalization has lost steam more and more each year. The basic reason is that it has been mainly, if not exclusively, about costs. And so there has been competition among national economies on costs, forcing some countries to lower wages and also to degrade quality. Let's say that this modern globalization, because the globalization was also there in the time of the Roman Empire, as first they imported grains from Sicily, then they cost less those from Egypt, and they imported from Egypt. But what has changed in our time is a fundamental issue, and that is that in practice, this globalization could not be exercised on quality. Thus, in practice, countries like Italy were forced to lower wages to compete with countries that instead had to export based on their lower wages, creating inextricable problems. However, this globalization began when workers' wages were lowered in the United States, so it was necessary to import low-quality, low-priced products to maintain the level of demand and consumption. This allowed countries like China to develop. That is, they took advantage of the situation, while countries like Italy, instead of integrating with countries like China and competing on the basis of the quality of our products, led to paths that did not bring any results. Today, we suffer the consequences. Still, during the 1960s, for example, the problem of hunger in Africa that did not exist because Africans produced their own grains, their own millet, their own sorghum, and at some point they started importing cheap wheat and flour that came from North America, and they uprooted all their indigenous production. Then, when prices went up in the 70s, there was the debt problem of African countries because the ruling classes born out of independence struggles were ousted to replace them with corrupt classes that imported arms and luxury goods. And then it turned out that with inflation, the mass of Africans no longer had the money to buy the baguettes and flowers that came from North America. But now we have, in my opinion, a great opportunity. Prices, rather than costs, which remain the same, of these grains are going up because there is no availability of these grains due to no investment in infrastructure, or rather because the ships are stopped in the Black Sea. At this point, an agreement should be made between Russia, Italy, and African countries, especially those who have shown that they care about their peoples, to use these Ukrainian grains while the African countries are reorganizing because prices are going up, to start producing their own millet, their own sorghum that can be planted in the rainy season. That is, in a few months. And then you have to use these grains that are under the control of Russia to get to the rainy season. And what will be planted? Besides millet and sorghum, also ancient grains. Today in Italy, and particularly in Sicily, Apulia, Campania, and Calabria, so many young people have gone back to the land and allowed us to replace 40 billion euro in food imports. We are world leaders in organic and biodynamic. At this point, I believe that we can reverse the perspective and take advantage of this war to give back to Africans what has always been Africans, and that is a productive capacity. I will also tell you about an experience I had in Congo with my missionary brother. We put water on plowed land and ears of corn sprouted, and people who did not have the money to buy baguettes got their bread made from their grains. Of course, the productivity of that land is low, and so we need to get out of the capitalist logic and globalization, and especially in a few years, when hypothetically cheap grains and cereals come back, I believe that these African countries that have demonstrated their strength, their independence, and will dialogue with Russia, and I hope with Italy, when we will be free from the yoke of these subjects who have been dominating us and denying our democracy for years, and will have been overcome by the just revolt of my country and of my fellow countrymen. I believe that these African countries will refuse to import again the low-priced grains and cereals to expand their own. And that will be the end of globalization and the restoration of an economy where quality, independence, democracy, and dialogue among all peoples will return.
Auspico dunque che per andare in controtendenza.
So, I hope that in order to go against the trend of the last decades, we must take advantage of this geopolitical situation that is forcing a very important change on the planet. There is no longer the unipolar world under American command, but a multipolar world that will have to dialogue. That means we have to investigate what will be the new Bretton Woods, as Lyndon LaRouche said so many years ago, and continue to advocate as long as he was alive until a few years ago. That is the way also to regulate economies and revive with a system of credit and at any rate non-debt currency economic development. It is a matter of redoing the infrastructure, having more and more efficient international connections, advancing scientific research in all fields, and then creating a world where there is harmony among local productions, where there are also basic ones for countries that have these characteristics: food, clothing, housing, household products, etc. on the one hand, and on the other hand, develop all those technologies that will allow humanity to grow. This will allow us to show that there are not too many of us on the planet, but exactly the opposite. Because if we look at the problems of Africa, for example, we see that it is underpopulated. But in order for it to be properly populated, we have to revive projects like Transaqua, to bring water from the Congo River basin to Lake Chad, also drainage projects, so that we avoid the evaporation of the Nile. But we have to remember that today, unlike a few decades ago, desalinators work very well. They can be powered by atomic energy with thorium generators and in other ways, and produce very good water. I experienced in recent years some plans that Italian company Enel did to produce water with desalination in some islands, and it was no different from bottled mineral water. It was very good. It is not like it used to be that you couldn't drink it. Today it is good. It is very good for irrigation. There are Arab countries that are becoming gardens thanks to these technologies. We don't see why not to extend to the whole planet this opportunity that always comes from collaboration between peoples in a democratic logic according to agreements, as we said, of a new Bretton Woods that takes into account monetary aspects, credit aspects, but in general, those of economic collaboration.
Thank you to Nino Galloni for that presentation. I neglected to mention the title was Make Africa Self-Sufficient Again, which he covered in his presentation. Now we're going to hear from Geoff Young. He's the official Democratic Party nominee for U.S. Congress from Kentucky's 6th Congressional District. And his topic is, what must change in Washington before the U.S. can join the Belt and Road Initiative? Geoff Young, the floor is yours.
Hi, my name is Geoff Young, and unlike my Republican opponent in November, Andy Barr, I will never vote to send weapons to Nazis. I've been running for various offices since 2012, but on May 17th of this year, I finally won a Democratic primary for the U.S. House of Representatives in Kentucky's 6th Congressional District. Please hold your applause until the end. 15 years ago, I never thought I would run for any office. From 2009 until 2013, I was a member of the very small Kentucky Green Party. The first campaign I really worked on was the independent campaign of Gatewood Galbraith for governor in 2011. Gatewood was ahead of his time. He supported the legalization of marijuana for many years before that, and wrote a very readable book called The Last Free Man in America Meets the Synthetic Subversion. Tragically, he died of natural causes shortly after his last campaign in 2011. In 2012, I ran for the first time for any office for the Kentucky State House of Representatives in my section of Lexington. I was still a Green and I lost, but I learned how elections work in Kentucky. In 2013, I decided to run for the U.S. House of Representatives against Republican Andy Barr, who was in his first term at that time. The Greens didn't approve of my aggressive, attacking campaigning style, so I switched back to my lifelong party and ran as a Democrat. I had one establishment opponent who spent all of her time on the phone raising money. I spent about $27,000 of my own money in the primary compared to Jensen's $250,000, but I got 39% of the vote. I think that scared the Democratic Party establishment in Kentucky to death. She won the primary, but lost to Andy Barr. I ran for governor of Kentucky in the 2015 Democratic primary against Jack Conway, who had several $1 million saved up and was the Attorney General of Kentucky. I attacked him for having supported the Cheney-Bush illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003. The party establishment blatantly rigged the primary, gave all kinds of in-kind resources to Jack Conway. So I filed a ballot challenge against him before the primary and another one before the general election. I'm not a lawyer, but I learn more about the law with every lawsuit I file. So far, all of them have been thrown out before the discovery phase by corrupt Kentucky judges. I ran for the US House in 2016 and 2018, for governor again in 2019, the US House in 2020 as a Republican. I switched back to the Democratic Party and finally won the Democratic primary this year by a narrow margin of 52 to 48% on May 17th. I think two things contributed to my win. One, I rented a billboard 5 months before the primary that said abolish the CIA, which got a lot of attention. Two, I mailed out a postcard to 22,000 Democrats just before the primary that said on the front, vote for Geoff Young, the peace candidate, and my motto, unlike Andy Barr, I will never vote to send weapons to Nazis. And on the other side, it had a bunch of pictures from mainstream media articles from 2014 to 2021, showing pictures of Ukrainian Nazis and warning the public and warning Congress, I suppose, that the federal government was actually sending weapons and training and sending money to Ukrainian Nazi groups in order to fight against Russians, ethnic Russians in Ukraine, and eventually the country of Russia. And I said, there's no way that Andy Barr can deny that he knew about this. He's known about it for the last 7 or 8 years, and he's never objected. And he therefore supports sending weapons to Nazis. And he's actually urging or demanding that President Biden send even more weapons than the $40 billion that Congress just approved. That's not enough for Andy Barr, my Republican opponent. So I think those two things contributed to my narrow win this year. The other point I want to address is how can we bring the United States into this newly emerging multipolar world where we cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative and help 2 or 3 billion more people in the world rise out of extreme poverty? My main answer to that is that before the empire, loosely centralized in Washington, D.C., can even think about joining China, Russia, India, and the Belt and Road countries, we first have to stop trying to destroy them. There's no way we can join if we're overthrowing their governments, playing war games directly on the borders of Russia and in the South China Sea, and acting in an unbelievably hostile way. So how can America change virtually all of our foreign policies 180 degrees? I have some ideas of first steps that I will try to launch if I win in November and go to the US House. First step would be to fire all the neocons. Neocons are people who believe that the United States has the right to attack or invade any country in the world, overthrow their government if they've been named as an official enemy. And there are plenty of neocons in the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party. Totally bipartisan foreign policy, really since the end of World War II in 1945. So our whole foreign policy, bipartisan, has to be reversed. 2, we should start turning the Democratic Party into a peace party again. It has gone along with the neocons and with the military, industrial, intelligence, media complex, and is now kind of a Me Too party for imperialism, which the Republicans have always supported just kind of reflexively. We have to abolish the CIA. Ever since it was founded in 1947, it has been in the business of assassinating people, torturing people, overthrowing governments hostile to the empire. And we have 16 other intelligence agencies, so let's get rid of the worst one and save some money. Speaking of saving money, we need to cut the so-called defense budget by 70% and the number of our troops by 70%. We have to end all of our economic sanctions against all countries and all individuals, especially Russia, because those sanctions are backfiring and destroying our own economy, not harming Russia very much at all. We should quit NATO first and then quit all of our other military alliances. We need to train the State Department to how to do diplomacy instead of issuing ultimatums and fighting proxy wars. We have to break up the 5 huge mainstream media corporations and the biggest social media corporations because they do nothing but propagandize us now, 24/7, 365. All of the propaganda favors war and empire. So that's some initial ideas, and I'd be happy to answer some questions that may come in.
Thank you for that, Geoff Young, who's the Democratic nominee for Congress in Kentucky's 6th Congressional District. I think you probably will be getting some questions. Again, send your questions in to questions@schillerinstitute.org. Now, our next speaker has addressed the Schiller Institute before. He's Ambassador Leonidas Chrysanthopoulos. He's the former Greek ambassador to Poland, Canada, and Armenia, and the former Secretary General of the Black Sea Economic Cooperation Organization. His topic is the crisis in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Belt and Road Initiative. Go ahead, Mr. Ambassador.
Hello from Aegon, Greece. I'm very happy to participate tonight in this important meeting. Witnessing what has been going on the planet since December gives one the impression that serious political leaders no longer exist, and they are still behaving incoherently and doing everything possible to destroy humanity. The situation in the Eastern Mediterranean was complicated enough before the war, but now it has even become more complicated, basically because of Turkey, who is taking advantage of the war in Ukraine to promote its own agenda. Turkey, for the first time in its relations with Greece, has raised the issue of the sovereignty of the Greek islands adjacent to Turkey, and is being questioned, saying that these islands were wrongfully given to Greece and should have been given to Turkey, even though the international treaties are very clear on it. Violations of Greek airspace and territory are a daily occurrence, while on the political level, Turkey has cut off all high-level talks with Greece. Turkey has also prohibited Greece from making drilling explorations in the waters near Crete for oil and gas, claiming that the area is Turkey's jurisdiction. The same applies to other areas also, and now Ankara will start drilling explorations in the Aegean. Furthermore, Turkey does not allow the Republic of Cyprus to proceed with exploration in the waters north of Cyprus, saying again that the area belongs to Turkish jurisdiction. The situation has become critical, and it cannot be excluded that an armed conflict erupts between the two NATO countries, which would give a great satisfaction to Russia, seeing NATO in further disarray. Turkey is also threatening to invade Syria in order to create a 30-kilometer zone from Syria proper that would not allow the Kurdish YPG to enter. And for its own reasons, Ankara is blocking the entry into NATO of Sweden and Finland. It's quite clear that these two countries will not join NATO, since they will not turn over to Turkey political refugees. Ankara has not adopted sanctions against Russia and is mediating or trying to mediate between Moscow and Kiev. Greece has become a US extension and has signed the Mutual Defense Cooperation Agreement with Washington, giving its military bases in Crete and Alexandroupolis to the Americans. Athens thinks that these bases will protect Greece from an attack against Turkey, while Washington considers them as part of the encirclement of Russia. It is doubtful whether these bases will do anything in case of a Turkish attack. Athens is following orders from Washington and has thus sent weapons to Ukraine. It has resisted removing armed personnel carriers that are on Greek islands until Germany sends their replacements first, in order not to leave these islands unprotected. But it seems that this plan has fallen apart because the Germans cannot guarantee to send these weapons beforehand. The economic situation of Greece is not good, and after 10 years of austerity measures imposed by the memoranda of the EU, the public debt as percentage of GNP has increased from 124% in 2010 to 211.9% in 2020. This disaster might have been avoided had Germany agreed to return to Greece the 450 billion euros, yes, 450 billion euros that it owes from war reparations and from the 1941 loan. But Berlin refuses even to discuss it, while it has no problem of accusing Russia of having committed crimes against humanity in Ukraine. The increase of energy and food prices is not making the situation easier in Greece. Being a US extension, Greece is also facing problems with the traditional enemies of the USA, like Iran. Upon request of the USA, Greece apprehended a tanker of Russian interest carrying Iranian oil, which according to the US authorities would be used to finance terrorist activities or launder money. Tehran apprehended 2 Greek tankers in reprisal, and after a Greek court found the impounding of the tanker carrying Iranian oil illegal, the tanker was released, the impounded oil returned, thus opening the way for the release of the 2 Greek tankers. The situation in the Middle East has not changed, with Israel implementing an apartheid regime on the Palestinian territories, bombing Syria, threatening Iran, and using state terrorism to execute Iranian senior officials. One cannot see any possibilities of positive changes there. Another threat endangering humanity is the attempt of the USA to present China as an enemy, like Russia. Here, Washington is making a big mistake. A country with a civilization of more than 5,000 years that has contributed so much to humanity cannot be named as an enemy by a country that's 300 years old and has created such damage to the world since the end of the Second World War. Would it not be better for all if the big countries of the world decided to work together to develop the planet for the benefit of humanity, instead of trying to control it and increase their zones of influence? They should stop their killing machines, their threats of nuclear holocaust. They should liberate themselves from the influence of the military-industrial complex. They should get rid of their blindfolds and see how humanity and themselves can prosper under peaceful conditions. And this is where the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, has a primordial role to play. The BRI project, when and if completed, will integrate the Eurasian continent by land, rail, and road, and by sea. Goods will be exchanged between the 2 sides quickly and without big costs. Projects are being implemented concerning the BRI, both in Europe and in Asia. Closer bilateral cooperation between China and the countries of Europe is required. The Maritime Silk Road also involves Greece, where the activities of COSCO in the port of Piraeus constitute the most important activity to date of China's One Belt, One Road approach in Europe. The US's negative position is the most important element that could hinder progress of the BRI. Efforts, bilateral, multilateral, or others, should be undertaken by the participants in order to convince Washington of the benefits that it would have by participating in this project. In this sense, closer contacts with Japan, Australia, and India are needed to examine how the Asia-African growth corridor could be incorporated within the BRI project. A basic prerequisite for the implementation of this project is that peace and stability must prevail and sanctions must be eliminated, something that cannot happen today. However, the implementation and promotion of this project can also facilitate peace initiatives if the parties in conflict are able to understand that their participation in the BRI greatly surpasses possible benefits from victorious conflicts. This applies to the US, Russia, the EU, China, and the countries of Asia and the Middle East, including Turkey, Iran, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and Israel. Such was the experience with the Black Sea Ring Highway, where differences between some Black Sea member states, BSEC member states, were able to be softened down to the extent that the highway was allowed to pass through zones of frozen conflicts. It might also help in the pacification of the European war that's being waged in Ukraine. It might also pacify the Eastern Mediterranean. In a world where armed conflicts and violence prevail and international law has ceased to exist, it is important to stress the role of culture, philosophy, humanism, and spirituality. They must be transported through the Silk Road in the form of exchange of ideas and culture between the East and the West. The Schiller Institute, through the active participation of LaRouche in many international fora and by organizing meetings like today's, is positively contributing towards peace in Europe and in the world. In conclusion, the successful implementation of the BRI can play an instrumental role in the humanization of international relations, the economic and cultural development of populations of the participating states, and in this way, create conditions for global peace. But first, global leaders must get rid of their blindfolds and start seeing again. It might sound utopic, but if we don't believe in utopia, it will never happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, especially for your optimistic conclusion. Our final presentation on this panel, which is on the economic policy under the title Runaway Inflation or Glass-Steagall, is from food producers, a food producers roundtable. Virtually the whole world is now aware that there are food shortages that are threatening the lives of millions of people. But unlike the charges of President Biden, the NATO and European Union leaders, this was not caused by anything that had to do with the Russian military operations in Ukraine. It predated that. The World Food Program has been warning for almost 2 years of the increased numbers of people threatened with starvation, which has a lot to do with sanctions policies, with the policies of the corporate cartels that are the grain cartels and so on, as well as the green policies. So to discuss this question of how to ensure there's an adequate and safe food supply, we're going to have a round table. The speakers will introduce themselves, but we'll start with an introduction from Bob Baker, who's the agricultural liaison of the Schiller Institute. Bob?
Hello, I'm Bob Baker with the Schiller Institute. You are now going to hear from 8 American farm leaders and fishery leaders about the terrible conditions food producers face. They speak here for the purpose of identifying the productive principles of production we must have for a new system, one that will guarantee food and a future for everyone in the world. We have a world food emergency. The millions of people now suffering extreme hunger will turn into 1 or 2 billion at the starvation point. World grain stocks and output are going down. This must stop. It's a question of culture, of science, and statecraft. We're all in this. The Schiller Institute started a Food for Peace initiative in 1988 in Chicago to prevent what we now see unfolding. Today, let us all join in together and renew what it takes for food for peace. The farm leaders you're going to hear are from 5 states, from the Midwest, from California, and from Alaska. We will begin with Colorado and Kansas. Thank you.
This is Mike Callicrate. I'm in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I have a food company here and also a livestock producing operation in St. Francis, Kansas, which is right on the border. So basically, we built a model of the food system that I think works going forward. I want to thank Helga LaRouche and the Schiller Institute for the opportunity to present today on this issue of sort of this global monopoly financialization of everything, and especially including the financialization of our food system. And I agree, there can be no peace unless we can get justice, and there can also be no peace unless we can get food, adequate food to the world's hungry people. And I see the financialization, I see the global financial monopolies just totally destroying any hope of getting the job done, of actually feeding the world's hungry. And it reminds me a little bit about how I learned how important food is and how important the wealth that's created from the production of food is to our global economy. And I was at my 10th year class reunion in Evergreen, Colorado, and Tina Owen's mother said, "Mike, what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I farm and ranch." And she says, "Oh, wow, you're a wealth creator." And I had never really thought about it that way. And she said, "Yeah, when I was a young girl," she says, "my grandfather explained how farmers and ranchers create wealth. And he also said, but the problem is that everyone else does the laundry and they're making more than they should." And when you see so much power in the financial sector, I basically compare it to like a tapeworm. They basically drain the wealth that's created from the land and from the people who do the work, and they put it in their own pockets and concentrate that wealth into the hands of fewer and fewer people. And as we know throughout history, the greatest threat to any free society is the concentration of power and wealth. And so I would love to see the global financial system that is extracting wealth from all wealth creators, whether they're in agriculture or whether it's mining of resources or whatever. It simply has to stop. And we've got to get them back to doing some real work again. And we've got to prioritize the interests of those wealth creators, whether they're the people who grow our food or the people who make other things, or the workers within the system that add the value to put it to put food on our plates. We've got to start to prioritize them again in building a new food system. And the new food system should be based upon family farmers and ranchers providing good stewardship, providing good husbandry to livestock, addressing climate issues through better forms of production agriculture. And I want to be able to see the governments of the world support these kinds of food systems that, once again, will create wealth and will provide good food security in all parts of the world. The world should feed itself. The United States, the biggest lie ever is that we were going to feed the world. We can't even feed ourselves today with the control of the Brazilians over our meat industry, the Chinese over our pork industry. We are in horrible shape. We cannot feed ourselves, and we are vulnerable to the meltdown of the global financial system. So I would like to see the financial system go away, not just declare bankruptcy, but just go away and localize financial systems so they serve the people instead of corporations around the world. I would like to see, going forward, no conglomerate being allowed any ownership of any essential or critical industry. A good example currently is the baby formula. Abbott is part of a government-sponsored monopoly for producing baby formula, but their baby formula business is only 5% of their business. They really don't care about it that much. The CEO probably doesn't even look at it, but look at how it has impacted this conglomerate control of food, a critical food ingredient, how it has impacted America. That has got to stop. And it's going to, of course, take a willing Congress to start enforcing some antitrust laws. We're going to have to break up the concentrated power and wealth. And in order to do that, it's going to take a new court system with judges that favor antitrust law enforcement rather than the Reagan appointees who believed government was the problem and that corporations don't need regulations. The trade should not be between Cargill and us. It should be between people that produce the food and people who eat the food. This is the food system we are building here in Colorado Springs. Another recent example is Cargill in Ukraine. Cargill is one of the biggest global predators on the planet. Cargill should not be allowed to be even involved in any of the critical industries. We simply need to break up this corporate power around the world. These are the real captains of industry. These are the real controllers of our food supply. These are like strip miners. They take it all. They take the entire resource till it's gone, and then they go somewhere else and do business. They search the world for the hungriest people that will work the cheapest to sell that production into the highest consuming markets, which has been the United States. But if you really look at our financials, we're broke, and we need to favor more wealth creation in our country, and we need to support those who actually produce the wealth that we need to survive, in particularly in the way of food.
Hello, I am Jon Baker from rural Iowa. I am a fourth generation cattle producer and a community banker. I would like to thank Helga LaRouche and the Schiller Institute for the opportunity to talk with you guys today. I am going to go through a couple of points here on the conditions of agriculture and the conditions of rural America. We are at a breaking point here in rural America. Our family farmers are to the point where they are either retiring or forced to grow to a size that extends a comfortable financial situation. The diversity that the family farm had at one point and offered as a safety net does not exist anymore. A lot of young producers are entering into custom growing contracts with large vertical integrators for livestock, mainly pork and poultry, as their source of diversification. I believe we got to this point in the last 30 to 40 years with the basis of cheap food. The farm programs were designed for cheap food and favored large corporate processors, and a subsidy program for the producer's loss instead of a parity price program to keep the producer above cost of production. This allowed large multinational processors to buy products, mainly grain, at or below cost of production. That has driven a large majority of the family farmers off the land or out of production. I believe the best way that we can counteract the last 30 to 40 years of that policy is to go back to the economic policies that our country was based on and founded on, using LaRouche's 4 laws as the main driver. Production, physical production, and infrastructure is the key.
I'm Wilbur Kehrli, here with my son Ken and grandson Kyle. My grandparents and my parents went through the Great Depression back in the 20s and 30s. I've been in agriculture my whole life of about 84 years. I've seen really a lot of things come and go. And the sad part of it, I've seen the downfall of the independent producer. Wall Street and the mega systems are kind of controlling our production, and they are not more efficient. They just control the value of the products, and that is leading to the demise of the independent producers. Back in 1920s, There was an act, the Packers and Stockyards Act was put into law, and it was used and broke up the railroads and the packer domination in our system. That act is still there. We do not have politicians with enough intestinal fortitude to enforce it. So the independent producers and the consumers both are being really taken advantage of at this point in our production system. There is light at the end of the tunnel. We've got to overhaul the banking system, put back in the Glass-Steagall Act, return fair market value for ag products, put culture back into agriculture. It's more than just agribusiness.
Hi, my name is Ken Kehrli, and I'm a independent pork producer from Northeast Iowa. I've been a full-time pork producer since 1985, and I've watched our industry consolidate from what was an independent, smaller farm model to much larger numbers now. It's a very efficient system in volume when everything works. With the past problems, packing house, employee positivities for COVID, plant shutdowns, these kinds of things, it disrupted our industry greatly. We're now looking at the threat of a foreign animal disease and those shutdowns, and basically that's terrible for the people that care for the animals and for the animals. Again, a very efficient system. We can produce pork in the U.S. As cheaply as anyone in the world and as efficiently, and it's a great protein product. The problem is when the system is disrupted, the problems just multiply. And so as we look at this, the only solution that I can come up with, particularly now with food security as such an issue worldwide, is local systems. So, and that includes humane harvest, packaging, processing, cutting to local consumer specs, and that whole system being recreated that can serve individual families, restaurants, food service, groceries. We've actually got, in some instances, meat cases in Iowa that are short of meat products. And it looks to me like adding that component at least to our production system here would be a great benefit. Currently in the US, 1 out of every 5 pigs needs to be exported. And when containers aren't available, or there's geopolitical issues that shut down that flow of pigs, further consolidation in our industry occurs because it puts more independent producers out of business. And again, we're in the middle of the breadbasket of the United States in Iowa, and you've got the average consumer worried about food security. So again, maybe local production, local systems is a positive moving forward.
I'm Kyle Kehrli. I live here in Northeast Iowa with Wilbur and Ken. I'm the 5th generation of our family to farm here in the US, and I've got 2 little girls, 4 and 6. So they'll be the 6th generation, hopefully. I worked in town for 7 years prior to coming home, and I've been home farming full-time for 4 years now. So when I graduated in 2005, farm ground was bringing about $5,000 an acre. And then today here in 2022, that number is about $18,000 to $20,000 an acre. So we've seen some rapid inflation just over a short time period. makes it very difficult for young producers to try to come back and start from scratch. You need this generational support in order to make a go in ag. And that's, we're seeing this loss of generational knowledge as these younger guys are struggling to come back and try to get into the game. Another issue that we have when we try to go to the sale barn or buying stations, if we can find them, they've also gone by the wayside as these larger corporations take over control of the supply of animals coming into the system. But as we try to go into those sale barns and buying stations, there's fewer and fewer buyers at those events. And so it's difficult to have a competitive price for your product, which in the case of a beef animal, you're looking at 16 months from birth to harvest. It represents a lot of time, effort, and energy and money. And that can all go by the wayside in 20 seconds in the sale ring. We don't have enough competition in there to get a fair price for the product that we're producing.
We want to thank the LaRouche organization for the opportunity to participate. I think keeping the family in our structure today is critical. And I think maybe we should be reminded of the David and Goliath story from the Bible. Picture yourself as David, and I think we need to picture our government and our corporations as Goliath. And with that in mind, full speed ahead.
My name is Frank Endress, and my sons and I are farming here in the Sacramento Valley of California, and we are struggling to survive the worst drought that we've had here in 127 years. And so that's what we're doing here. Okay, I could have mentioned also the re-looking by many people now at the NWAPA project because of the drought in the whole western part of the United States is causing people now to look at another source of water, because our traditional sources here in California, the Shasta Lake project and also the Colorado River project is those reservoirs at dangerously low positions right now, and it's causing some farmers, like in the Imperial Valley, I know that they're dependent solely on the Colorado River for irrigating their crops there. Being a desert area, they are totally dependent on that water there to produce their crops. Well, I wanted to thank Helga LaRouche and also the Schiller Institute for making this available to be transcribed all over the world, other farm people and consumers as well, because we're on the verge of food security all over the world. Because farmers have been producing food for less than 30% of parity. This has caused a real severe crisis in our food production and our food security now. So we're glad to see, and I salute the farmers in other countries for the efforts that they're making over there, especially the farmers who just had some very good success in India by having some stability put into their crop prices over there. So I'm grateful for the opportunity that the Schiller Institute has provided, and I'd like to participate in the future as well.
Hello, I'm Jim Moore. I'm a commercial fisherman in the state of Alaska, And I've been fishing for about 53 years now. And I've seen a lot of changes in this industry. There are different kinds of commercial fisheries, and my particular type is trolling, which is hook and line fishery, as opposed to trawling. It's sometimes confused with trawling, which is towing nets through the water. But I'm past president of Alaska Trollers Association. I've been involved in fisheries politics for a decade or two or three, and I have 3 children. My wife and I raised them on our boat, at least for during the season. They did get to go to school and all of that, but I guess what I'm saying is that our particular type of fishing, this trolling, is like the fishing equivalent of the small family farm. They're mostly small family operations, and the families get the opportunity to work together, and there's a lot of benefits in that. Nearly all of my 9 grandchildren are classical musicians, as well as my children too. But anyway, I'm really distressed at our world situation, and challenged by it, you might say, because being a fisherman, you're an optimist. You if you're not catching, it's because you haven't quite got it figured out yet. There's fish out there somewhere, But looking at our world situation, it is very distressing. And in my in fisheries politics, I guess maybe I'll take it from this angle. We're facing a lot of challenges. One of the greatest ones that I see is the politicization of science, and actually the breakdown of science by consensus, the lack of hope for a future based on this narrative that's been programmed into us for a couple of generations, that humanity is the cause of the Earth's collapse of the ecosystems and all of this kind of stuff like that. And it's basically just junk science. And I've been distressed by that because most people engaged in our industry, as in other industries, productive industries, find it's really difficult to be able to hire young people that are good workers. And a lot of it's because they have no hope. They'll hope for a beautiful future, which I believe we can create, and a lot of it has been instilled to them through these horrible narratives, like your very breath is destructive to the atmosphere of the Earth, and it's going to cause catastrophic climate change and all this kind of stuff. I take a lot of young people out fishing, and I'm heartbroken at seeing the demoralization of an entire generation that's been fed these lines of hopelessness. And I think it can be reversed, and I think the way it's been made very clear by the principles of economy that Lyndon LaRouche has laid out. I think it's referred to sometimes as the 4 laws. I wrote a letter to the president back in 2020. It was President Trump at that time, and I think I'll just read some of what I wrote then. It's absolutely essential that we invest in infrastructure upgrade, the actual physical economy, rather than in another bailout of the bankrupt international financial system, backfilling their gambling losses and enabling the continuance of the so-called too big to fail private banking cartels. We should have learned that by now. A casino economy based on speculation has replaced our former production-based economy since 1971 with the elimination of fixed exchange rates between nations, and especially since the repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999. Huge amounts of capital have been diverted into short-term risky investments which promised rapid turnover and high rates of return, gambling, rather than placed into maintaining and upgrading infrastructure, including healthcare infrastructure. The time is now to address this properly. Now, I wrote that over 2 years ago, and it's kind of strange when you think that the leadership that we have seen in this nation, in Congress, has failed to grasp the import of this and has failed to act. And this was written to the President of the United States by a fisherman. What are they doing up on the Hill in Washington, D.C.? Surely they must have seen this. It's really so evident. It's really so clear. But I'm not despairing, because reality is about to strike, and reality has a way of there's a correcting. And I'm so thankful for the influence on my life and on my thinking of the Schiller Institute and the LaRouche movement, the ideas and the writings of Lyndon LaRouche, which I've followed off and on, and now mostly on, for the last 30 years. And I am therefore hopeful that we can indeed have a beautiful future, but we have to act.
I'd like to thank Helga LaRouche and the Schiller Institute for the opportunity to speak today. My name is James Benham. I'm currently state president for Indiana Farmers Union. Also sat on a board for National Farmers Union. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about Glass-Steagall. About over 10 years ago, back 2013, well, 9 years ago, actually, I wrote an article that preferred that. And I'm really going to read that again because nothing really has changed in that. But I'm going to start with, I'm writing to urge you to act immediately to ensure that the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act is reinstated as the law of the land now. The industry and agriculture of our nations are in ruins. The suffering of the elderly and the poor today are intolerable. The suffering around the world has reached a famine stage in too many places. Let me speak about what I know about farming. As an active corn and soybean farmer, head of Indiana Farmers Union, National Farmers Union Board, I can tell you that the food supply of the world and this nation is in peril because we have let speculators set farm policy, as well as banking policy. Speculators determine the price of commodities at the expense of both producer and consumer. Speculators are driving farmers out of farming, and without farmers, who is going to produce the food? Pass Glass-Steagall, and we can get in the business of rebuilding the nations. We'll be able to pass farm and food supply legislation based on the principles of parity pricing for farmers and food security of Americans. The domestic production reserve, we can finance urgently needed water projects such as North American Water and Power Project or NWAPA. Now, let me recap on a couple of those things, because when we talk about Glass-Steagall, back in 2013, there was a couple bills in Congress trying to pass that. Today, things have gotten worse because there's no such bill in Congress. They have gotten way past that. to where they are actually enslaved to the banking system and speculators we have in the world today. We have a lot of people in Congress that are basically captives of this industry. And I used to talk about, and still do, and have been admonished for saying this, but we have the best politicians money can buy. And that's a fact. They just go in there and to make special interest groups fund these guys and gals, and they become to the point where they're not effective for the folks in the United States. As far as parity is something that we've talked about for a long time on agriculture, that we felt like that would be a fair shake at a good return on the investment for people to continually be able to produce food. The problem with what we have today and under our current system, and with the pandemic we've had and the shortage of supplies and the demand being high as it is, and commodity values are high. Farmers are making more money today than they have ever, with the exception of one problem. The inputs that they've got have climbed that same ladder, and so therefore they continually squeeze the value of the dollar that the farmer's receiving because of the speculation and the ability to increase their prices, because farmers have to have some of these inputs to produce a crop. One of the big things that was talked about early on, that most of our potash comes from Russia. We've had a mine or two here in the United States. They've long shut them down years ago. And so without that potash, there's a concern about the ability to raise crop. There's other alternatives, but none that people want to really try to explore, because it's easy and what people have been accustomed to doing. So with that, I'd like to finish up on a couple of things. I am a Christian. I do feel like we're in the end times, and that some of the things we're dealing with now are because of our turning away from the God's creation and the biblical means of doing things. And I did want to make one statement today, and it's a little bit like what we had in Sunday school this morning. It was in James chapter 1, verse 26. Those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religious is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows and their distress, and keep oneself from being polluted by the world. There's our challenge. How do we institute this? How do we get back in those kind of reins? And the understanding of the fact that people that are in charge of these things that are now, that's causing us all these troubles, are not going to give it up easy. So I'll end with this. What are we prepared to do? Just simply, what are we prepared to do? Thank you so much. You all have a great day, and I hope this has been a worthwhile message. Thank you.
So we've had a whole series of presentations that have taken up various aspects of the financial system, its collapse, its impending collapse, the danger implicit in it, and proposals on how to get out of this. And we'd like to take this now into the panel and bring the panelists back up. I think we have a few people who are here for taking questions. Okay, good. Wow, okay. I'd actually like then to start with Helga, who's here to join us. Helga, do you have any thoughts after hearing these presentations about how this gets toward what you were talking about, of how we can do mission impossible in reversing the economic collapse?
Well, I would like to ask the panel participants what they thought, and if they heard my earlier proposal, if we would start an international campaign for a new Bretton Woods and the 4 laws, as part of the package. If we would, try to collect as many signatures as we can, we may be able to get thousands and tens of thousands of such signatures. And given the fact that the inflation will get worse for sure, or you will have more bankruptcy, in any case, the economic situation will get much worse. And maybe some of the panelists could comment on that and how they see the prospect of doing a thing like that.
All right, why don't we start with Diane, and we'll just go around the pictures here. Diane?
Okay, great. Well, I think it's a wonderful idea, and I was really happy that Geoff Young was on this panel, because the fact that he won the Democratic primary with the kind of platform that he had, I think is important for people to know internationally who wonder if the entirety of the American population has lost their mind. And so it indicates that there's hope. The question of a new Bretton Woods, based on Lyndon LaRouche's conceptions of international cooperation and development, I think is critical, because we're facing something terrifying to most, which is that the system is totally and thoroughly bankrupt. And when you say that, everyone panics because they begin to think about money, and they begin to wonder whether they're going to be able to survive. So the advantage of making reference also to something which occurred in the lifetime of some people, our older generations, unfortunately, we're much diminished for not having more World War II generation people among us, but that it wasn't so long ago, and that it was international in scope, and the aspects that Franklin Roosevelt intended where it fell short, namely the role of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, we can set up some new international equitable system. So I think it's a very good idea, and something which could be a real rallying cry, as long as we are very clear that what we are proposing is distinct from some of the sophists and lying groups who have called for a new Bretton Woods but don't mean anything like what you are talking about.
Since Diane mentioned you, Geoff, did you have some thoughts about Helga's proposal to launch a mobilization for a new Bretton Woods?
Well, please remind me, was the old Bretton Woods designed to have fixed exchange rates between the currencies of different countries all over the world? Is that, what do you mean by a new Bretton Woods, please?
Helga, do you want to
Well,
answer that?
What we mean by that is essentially the Bretton Woods as it was intended by Franklin D. Roosevelt. He had the idea that the most important aspect of it would be to increase the living standard of the developing countries. And then, unfortunately, he died prematurely, and the actual shape of the Bretton Woods system, which still was very useful for about 2 decades, in terms of the third world aspect, it was more shaped by the outlook of Churchill and Truman, and therefore there are many people in the developing countries who don't like the idea when you say new Bretton Woods. But if you look at the economic platform of Lyndon LaRouche, or rather the draft protocol for the superpowers, which he wrote in 1984, he says there the absolute first condition of a new credit system must be to increase the living standard of the developing countries. And naturally, he was very, very prescient when he recognized that when Nixon decoupled the dollar from the gold standard, and especially replaced the fixed exchange rates with floating exchange rates, that was the beginning of the disaster. So yes, fixed exchange rates, which naturally periodically have to be adjusted, and a certain band has to be there, but it's absolutely important to prevent currency speculation and to prevent the kinds of manipulations what we have been seeing in the last several years. So the answer is emphatically yes, it does mean fixed exchange rates, and it means especially that the power of credit generation is being brought back to the sovereign power of governments, and not in the hands of private bankers like the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and other central banks are actually so-called private institutions who do not feel obliged to the common good, as we have seen. So that is my answer. Harley, if you want to add anything on Diane, go ahead.
Well,
I think
thank
just
you for
the only thing,
explaining that.
Geoff, let me The only thing I would add is that especially important is that the doing away with the fixed exchange rates opened the door for the speculative system, for the speculators to come in and decade by decade chip away at such things as the Glass-Steagall bill, banking regulation, the privatization of finance, which turned the economy into a global casino. And so Lynn's insistence on going back to the principles of the Bretton Woods, not necessarily the way it was carried out, but the original ideal, is to take the power away from speculators. And that's the importance of the Glass-Steagall proposal. Geoff, I'm sorry, why don't you go ahead and pick it up then?
Okay, well, thank you. I now understand it a little bit better. So I think, okay, so it's necessary. I'm here twice. It's necessary to, let's see, can I delete one of myself? Or can you? It's necessary to reduce the power of financial institutions, especially for-profit ones, worldwide. I agree with that part of it. I think, I don't think fixed exchange rates are the solution. I don't think they're even part of the solution. The problem is that over the decades in the West, United States, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, Japan, financial institutions have displaced and hollowed out the productive economy. I think that's the real problem. And that can be addressed by things such as the Glass-Steagall Act for the 21st century, or its original form from 1933. But the political power of the banking industry has to be curtailed severely. Speculation, you know, a small amount of speculation is fine. You've got some countries that, you know, their currencies might be overvalued. They may be making some mistakes in their policies. And, you know, there should be a market response when a country messes up. And you know, they may be running deficits that are too high. Their currency, the value of their currency should decline. So speculation itself is not a problem, but predatory vulture speculation is a problem where, say, the Western banks decide that Venezuela has to be punished because they're, quote, too socialistic. They engineer a run on the Venezuelan currency and they impoverish the entire country. That has to be stopped. Now, I think China's approach and the Belt and Road Initiative approach is an excellent alternative to a speculative, bank-dominated world economy. What China does is they propose a project, you know, along the Belt and Road to one of the countries that is on the route and say, okay, what do you need to develop your economy? And they talk with the country and say, they end up saying, yes, we will finance a high-speed rail system from here to there. We will finance the upgrading and repair of a port because it fits with our vision of the Belt and Road, and it will help every country along the route, first by employing people, and second, more important, from the long-term benefits of having a more effective interconnection with the rest of Asia and Europe. With joining the Belt and Road will help everyone. It's a win-win. So instead,
let me take it up with the other panel members. Give them a chance to say
great.
something
Yeah, sure. I've talked
about Helga's proposal. Jim Moore, what do you think? Do you think there's a willingness among people in your profession to make sure that we get back to the principles of the Franklin Roosevelt global economic development?
Well, I'm seeing that the principles behind the Bretton Woods are the constitutional principles of promoting the general welfare of the population, of humanity, and as reaching out. I mean, in the world right now, human life has been devalued incredibly. There's death stalking at the door. We're looking at the apocalyptic war and famine and disease. These things that Bertrand Russell and these Malthusians welcomed as necessary friends, right? And the value of humanity, if you have some sense, as I do, being a Christian myself, that of the tremendous value of humanity, it's got to be recognized, certainly, if we're going to move forward. And I'm thinking of, like, to take a little diversion here. I was educated in California, and I was in Berkeley in the 60s, and when a lot of this rock, drug, sex culture, this environmentalism, this that had some good elements in the beginning, but it was ultimately hijacked and became a political, philosophical, toxic influence. That's my opinion. And I just want to read a couple sentences from a review that that's Bill McKibben's The End of Nature. David Graeber, a biologist for National Park Service, expressed his own hopes. He says, human happiness, bear in mind the Constitution, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Human happiness, he says, and certainly human fecundity are not as important as a wild and healthy planet. I know social scientists who remind me that people are part of nature, but it isn't true. Somewhere along the line, at about 1 million years ago, maybe half that, we quit the contract and became a cancer. We have become a plague upon ourselves and upon the earth until such time as Homo sapiens should decide to rejoin nature. Some of us can only hope for the right virus to come along. I think our identity is at the root of the crisis. And a government that does not promote the general welfare, as the current government obviously is not, and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as an expression of the creative nature that God gave us, that government has got to be changed. And how do we get back there? I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, if we're going to do an education program or petition about reinstituting the Bretton Woods system, there's got to be a whole bunch of education to bring people to the point where they understand what it is and why we need it. And so
let me go to the ambassador now, Jim, because I think as someone who's seen the effects on his country of the free market European Union policies, he might have something to say about the idea of moving toward a mobilization for a new Bretton Woods. Leonidas, do you have some thoughts on that? Make sure you're unmuted.
Yes, I do indeed. It's an excellent idea. I think we should go towards that. The problem is that nobody is listening on this planet. We're trying to do things in Greece. We're trying to do things everywhere. Efforts should be made until somebody decides to listen. I mean, everybody is listening, but not doing anything about it. I mean, Greece has been destroyed by the memoranda policies that had been implemented. I mentioned briefly about it in my statement, and nothing much is changing. I also mentioned about the position of Germany, who owes Greece 450 billion euros basically from war reparations and from the loan of 1941. And Germany refuses even to discuss this issue. So we are facing all these kinds of problems. So I think that the return to the Bretton Woods to renegotiate the Bretton Woods system would be something very positive for humanity. And also at the same time, we should look at the issue of deleting the global debt, which would allow humanity to start on a new basis. And of course, that means that the banks would be out of the business that they're doing today without the Glass-Steagall Act. So this is a very good proposal that LaRouche has made. I think that we should work on it and try to convince people to listen and to adhere to it. That's a long struggle, but we should go to that for the benefit of humanity.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yes.
Bob, go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to just add to that, because when got rid of the Bretton Woods system and floated the dollar, very shortly the dollar collapsed 50% in value. And in agriculture and food production, that had a major effect, because what happened is when the dollar collapsed, all of a sudden U.S. grain was the cheapest grain in the world for the grain cartels to ship around all over the country, all over the world. And in many cases, that cheap grain put a lot of farmers out of business in other parts of the world. But it became very high in the United States. So the demand for grain moved our corn from $1.50 a bushel for where it had been for maybe 10 years to up to $3.50. And soybeans went to $14. And just to give some idea what that purchasing power was back then, that's like $80 today in terms of $2022 a bushel for soybeans. So the amount of income came into U.S. agriculture, and the Federal Land Bank put in variable rate interests at very low rates. So farmers started buying land, and the price went up, just shot up from around $350 an acre to over $2,200, I think it peaked out at. And then Volcker came in with the 20% interest rates, and land prices crashed 60% in about the next 14 months. Now, that's a huge stabilization process. It's just one example in agriculture, because this also had in all the industries, and started a process of monopolization like we've never seen. This is a process that, many people behind this in the Anglo-British American Wall Street banking circles. They knew this would happen, and that set in motion a policy we fought a revolution to get rid of.
All right, let's move on to the next question because we have a lot of questions here. I know maybe Helga would want to take this one, maybe Diane. It's from Miss Wei Wang, who's the Europe representative of the Chengdu Economic Daily. And she asks the question of what is the expected impact of the Ukraine crisis on global food security, refugee, health, and energy issues related to food supply, both for Europe and the developing world, and how are the countries and regions such as India, Africa, preparing themselves to deal with this? Helga, you want to take that?
Well, it is already pretty bad, and it's normally blamed on Putin, who's responsible for everything according to the mainstream media. But the reality is that, there are right now, the sanctions have basically made it impossible for especially Russia to export a lot of food, but also fertilizer, and that has greatly contributed to the crisis. There is right now an effort by Russia to help to ship the Ukrainian grain and other food reserves. The problem is that some of the ports have been mined by the Ukrainians, so this is very difficult. And this has also been a subject of discussion between Russia and Turkey, trying to get some of this grain shipped in other ways, and also by train to Europe, which naturally takes much longer. I think it would be very, I don't know, India wanted to make a deal with Russia to basically go into a big export of food, because they are also a very large food producer. But then they were hit by this incredible heat wave, and they were forced to cancel that to serve the needs of their own population. I frankly think that the developing countries are utterly unprepared to deal with this. And, I think what would be required is a global initiative. I think President Xi has talked about global security, food security, and is doing a lot. But I think given the dimension of the problem, I was talking about 1.7 billion people who are in danger of famine, according to the World Food Programme. What would be necessary is you have the G7 meeting. We heard earlier that they have invited India and South Africa. Well, if the G7 wants to, do something good, they should abandon the rules in European Union agricultural means to, they have this set aside 30 by 30 policy, which is the idea that, basically the agricultural area is supposed to be reduced by 30%. And they have the fork to farm policy, which is also very counterproductive. I think the governments of the world, all the organizations, the G20, the new emerging G8, the G7 plus India and South Africa, the UN, they should all make a decision that in light of this famine, there should be a policy of doubling the food production, which could be done if governments would make sure that the fertilizer is being bought, it's being distributed, that all the farms which have potential get credit, they get fertilizer, they get agricultural machines. And if that would be organized by the governments, you could increase the food production worldwide very rapidly. Now we are already in the mid of the summer in the Northern Hemisphere, but there's always some areas where you can still start a harvest and then you can move to the Southern Hemisphere very soon. I think it requires a top-down decision. I mean, it's like with the pandemic, the inability of certain governments to deal with measures, and then they are blaming China for a zero COVID policy. I mean, look at the result of it. China only had, I think, altogether 5,000 people dying from COVID. the United States had 1 million. Europe had also, I think, I'm not sure now, it was a very large number, almost as much as the United States per capita for sure. And that was the result that they did not take a zero COVID policy. And that is the problem. So I think that if we learned anything from the COVID handling, the governments of the world should be asked and put under pressure to double the food production. I mean, for example, you have countries which are incredible. Yemen, David Beasley made this incredibly beautiful, powerful video, which I think everybody should watch, called Hunger Ward, where you see how babies are dying of hunger. They have arms like my finger, of the strength of my finger. Take Afghanistan. They have they had at the beginning of the winter the danger of 25 million people dying of hunger. These are the things which must be addressed by a joint effort by the international community. And, you know, if there would be as much coverage about the starvation in places like Syria, Yemen, and many African countries, Afghanistan, like we have it about Ukraine, you know, then there would be a different public awareness of it. But naturally, this is not happening. You almost never hear about the horror shows which are going on. So I think that, you know, also from the panelists of this this panel, I think they should really contact the farmers in other countries, in Germany, in Italy, in India. I think there must be much more international cooperation to assert the necessary pressure to force through these changes.
Okay, now, yeah, Geoff, and let me just say we have a number of questions and a limited amount of time, so let's try and keep answers to the point. Go ahead, Geoff.
Measures that could address this question. It was framed in terms of the impact of the Ukraine conflict on the international food system, the resulting shortages and famines. I think the first thing that has to be done is to make Washington end and cancel all economic sanctions that we now have in place. Sanctions just, all they do is mess up the system. 2, Ukraine needs to surrender to Russia and let Russia bring peace to the country, denazify it, and allow normal day-to-day life to resume. That would include demining any areas of farmland that have been mined by the Ukrainian army, and just bring Ukraine back to normal. I think the only way to do that is for Ukraine to surrender. And 3, we should end NATO, which has been an aggressive force, threatening force to Russia and many other countries. Just cancel it, get rid of NATO, and the world will be a lot more able to deal with famines and crises if the world is peaceful. Thank you.
Diane, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, thank you. I do. Just as, in a sense, the military action in Ukraine has been used as the pretext we hear from President Biden that Putin is the one making gas so expensive and Putin is the one causing hyperinflation and so on. I think clearly what Helga has said has to be done, and the situation, especially the mining of the Black Sea by the Ukrainian military and the sanctions which prohibit Russian vessels from docking and unloading grain and things like that, have to be reversed. But actually, there was a policy paper put out by the Russian Foreign Ministry which makes the point that the food crisis had begun long before this, And there is a policy which was expressed by Prince Charles and others at COP26 and elsewhere of cutting food production. We saw this in the United States, where American farmers, recognizing the danger and the escalation of starvation, wanted to increase food production, but our Agriculture Secretary, Vilsack, I don't know why he's called the Agriculture Secretary, but at any rate, he said, no, this would be bad for the climate. We can't take land out of set aside. We can't increase food production because that would throw us off our goals for starving everyone to death. So I think we have to actually see that we've had, as Jim Moore was saying, a really anti-human policy, which says that human beings are a blight on the planet, that we shouldn't increase food production. The prices had already gone up. According to this Russian Foreign Ministry paper, the FAO food price index went up from 50% between 2019 and 2022, and wheat prices rose by 25% in 2021. This was all prior to the Russian military action. So we have a serious problem, which is largely an ideological one, that has to be reversed. And I think it can be, because I think if you ask people, do they intend that a quarter of the world's population nearly is going to die of starvation, most people would say no, but we have to put that into action.
Well, let me take up a couple of questions together that get at this whole question of how do you do a mobilization to realize these things. We have from David Baccini in Italy, who has a company where he's trying to issue bonds that would take money out of the speculative system and generate funds that would go into expansion of industrial districts, maximizing local workforce, and so on. He asks a question of how do you get policies that will organize, that can be implemented to allow this kind of industrialization policy to occur. It's another question, how do we get Glass-Steagall? So why don't we take that up, because we're in the middle of a discussion about what kind of mobilization is necessary. Besides the broad proposal from Helga on the New Bretton Woods, what other ideas do people have on this? Anyone?
Oh,
yeah,
Helga. Helga.
Well, when I was thinking about preparing for this conference, I reminded myself that, in the past, we had several mobilizations where we collected signatures from, as I said, thousands of people, hundreds of sitting parliamentarians, trade union leaders, farm leaders, and that reached actually a certain threshold. For example, in Italy, we had several bills, where the Camera and the different houses of the parliament voted up a majority for Glass-Steagall. The problem was that then the government changed and it didn't get implemented. But if you look at the number of signatures which we got at that time, it shows you that you can do it. And I think that now, we did one mobilization, I think in 2007, 2008, when the Lehman Brothers collapsed, and there was a real sense of a systemic crisis of, people were really panicked. And there was an openness for New Bretton Woods for a couple of weeks, but then at the next G20 meeting in Washington in November of 2008, everything was put back, and they then really started to go with this quantitative easing, printing money like crazy. So they did not attack the roots of why it had come to this systemic crisis. But that was a period in which people were absolutely prepared and willing to give their signature for such an initiative. And now, given the fact that the problem which is now coming, the hurricane of Jamie Dimon was mentioned several times, but there were many experts in the recent period who expressed that, this is a real, rock and hard place problem of the central banks between inflation on the one side and a sudden collapse on the other side. So I think if we would start with a core group of people, and we could write this out, adapting it to the present condition, I think it really could go wide. And if everybody who is in their own community would take responsibility to circulate it there, we would do the same thing internationally. I think it could really develop an incredible momentum. And if we can get then several governments, parliaments to adopt it, I mean, in reality, the meetings I was mentioning earlier between the Eurasian Economic Union and some of the other Asian countries, they are going in this direction already. They are creating a new system with capital controls, with exchange controls, because they want to protect themselves against speculative attacks. So I think I would suggest that we make a proposal, and then I'm absolutely sure that it will go away like hotcakes.
Well, I'm going to take a little liberty here from one of the questions that came in from Steve, who asked about Diane's petition campaign that demonstrates pretty much what you're talking about, Helga, or Geoff's victory in Kentucky, the possibility that people are ready to be mobilized. So he basically says, does this show that we have a potential now to mobilize people as you did in New York State? So that's for you, Diane.
I would say so. I think Bob also has something. But yeah, first of all, it has become clear that my campaign was the only campaign that even collected well over 45,000 signatures. And we did it by, in fact, I'm getting phone calls from people trying to figure out how we did it, because they can't imagine that you can do anything legitimately. There always has to be a gimmick or a catch or some special something that you paid or whatever. And we had close to 200 volunteers who went out and talked to people and asked them to sign to put my name on the ballot. And therefore we intersected, I don't know, we probably had conversations with 80 to 90,000 people, but maybe in the order of magnitude more saw us out there organizing. And the fact that so many willingly signed, there were those handful of Schumer supporters who refused, or some, being American first and Schumer supporters second, agreed that ballot access should not be restricted to only incumbents, and they signed in order that there could be a debate or could be questions. So I think that does indicate that people can be mobilized on principle. People will move now more likely on heavy ideas than on trivial ideas.
Yeah, I move to respond to what Helga is saying, that experts in every field should lay out the agenda of what needs to be done. We should do this with agriculture and food, and we can follow up on this after the conference. But the food producers, you already heard from, identified many principles that we must have for plenty of food and successful farming. So speculation, no speculation, plenty of credit, parity prices, food reserves, science breakthroughs, and so on. And we need family scale farming guaranteed for the knowledge that is transferred through that process, which is critical for all humanity. And also, I think the idea of a second green successor to the 1960s first green revolution is what we need. I thank Dr. Kordanov for our friend from Russia who spoke this morning, for putting that forward. That the point is, the first green revolution was based on science and building infrastructure, and based on the principle that every nation, every single nation, should and could be as self-sufficient in food as possible. And that's what, Henry Wallace believed, the founder of the Mexican Center for the Green Revolution in the 1940s, and he was the vice president under FDR and the agricultural secretary from Iowa. So, India became self-sufficient in grain in 1974, and Norman Borlaug came from the U.S.-Mexican work system, and so we must do this everywhere.
Let me get back to the question of the Belt and Road Initiative, just because I think we may have someone on the line from the Society of Economists of Peru. Dave, do we have Jose Apachia on? Well, if we do have him, let me know in a moment. Go ahead, Geoff. You had something to say on that?
Yes. I guess, well, I've been a member of the anti-war movement for about 40 years and involved in electoral politics for the last 10 years. And I've thought a lot about how to mobilize people. I approached that question by focusing, one, on stopping the worst villains, the people who are blocking progress, who are making things worse, and two, on amplifying the best ideas, whether they come from Kentucky or some other country in the world. So currently, my thinking is that the worst villains are Wall Street, huge banks, other countries' central banks, the Federal Reserve, which has been doing a really bad job for at least the last 15 years, military-industrial intelligence media complex, which is making it impossible for Americans to know up from down, mainstream media corporations, and the neocons. And the best ideas that I'm seeing now with regard to these international economic questions that have been on the agenda today are coming from Russia and China. There's a Russian economist now working on a new financial system based on gold, natural resources, and a basket of currencies. So let's just amplify what is coming out of Asia and Russia and reduce the power of all of these villains.
Now, we do have, is that Jose Apachia from Peru? Yeah, we're going to have a simultaneous translation. He has a question on the South American Bio-Oceanic Corridor, which is part of the broader proposals around the Belt and Road Initiative. So, Mr. Apachia?
Sí, efectivamente. Buenas tardes con todos. En principio quiero felicitar a los
I want to congratulate the Schiller Institute for the effort to share with the population your investigations respecting the necessities to elaborate a proposal to elaborate the new infrastructure, international financial infrastructure that humanity would have a shared future. And as part of that shared future precisely is the economic corridor of the bioceanic corridor between Peru, Brazil, that is being promoted by the by the College of Economists of Peru. This project is to create a train corridor that connects the Atlantic Ocean with the Pacific. And this project is of so much importance and is of historic importance for our country, which has the technical, is through the northern part of our country. It has been considered with the indicators of this has so many beneficial points, and among others, when this project is approved, the first inversion will be $10 billion. Oh, we lost the connection. I'm sorry, we lost the connection.
All right. Well, this is one of the proposals.
No, I think he's
part
back
of
on.
He's back on.
Mr. Apakla's microphone is on mute.
Habilitar más de 2 millones de hectáreas listas para la agricultura, que permitirá frenar la migración del campo a la ciudad por falta de conectividad. Permitirá también reducir.
This will allow us as well to reduce the migration towards the capital of Peru by opening up new lands to agricultural production. Imagine this is a result of the lack of productivity in the countryside. So this is a magical project. This bioceanic railroad is something that we have been promoting since 2016, since the memorandum of understanding was signed between President Xi Jinping and the President of Brazil and the President in Peru. So I would like to conclude by again thanking Mrs. Helga Zepp-LaRouche for her initiatives and all of the members of the LaRouche team with the following question. Is there a possibility to make this mega project a reality? This project of the Peru-Brazil bioceanic corridor? Thank you, and we hope to continue to work together just in the same way we have to swim upstream the same way salmon do to make sure that we make a reality of what is now a problem and to have a shared future for all humanity. Thank you very much.
I think his proposal speaks for itself, the way he presented it, that this does represent the kind of great project that's possible if we can break the control of the unipolar order and its free market looting policies. But if someone has something specific on this they'd like to comment, otherwise I have one final question for everyone, which I think gets back to this whole question of the mobilization. So maybe we should just proceed to that. This is actually sent in for Diane, but I think it's good for everyone. Liam writes that he said he's a young person and he's concerned that young people lack the skills or the desire to work productive jobs. They're not incentivized or encouraged to develop the skills needed to contribute to the productive economy. How can we inspire young people to develop the skills needed to contribute to the physical economy? So why don't we start? Jim, you want to take that first?
Sure. Thank you, Harley. Well, as you may have recognized, it's a concern of mine, and I guess I'm doing it one at a time. But I think just conferences like this help, and you know, the crisis that we're entering into now, you know, it can also be a kind of a wake-up call to it's an opportunity. You know, there's the old sayings that every crisis, when looked at with a proper perspective, presents an opportunity. I'm not coming up with a very good answer for you right now. Maybe I could way back in and let somebody else take it.
All right, Leonidas, you've had a situation in Greece where the future seems bleak for young people. What would you say to them about your ideas of giving them an opportunity to be inspired to want to rebuild the world economy?
Well, many of the Greek youth are leaving Greece, going abroad to find a better future for themselves. They see themselves here closed up. There's no way out for them. The governments are not helping at all. I speak to them and I try to tell them that if they work hard enough, that there is a future here. But they prefer to go abroad. I mean, we have about 500,000 of our population that has left for other countries of the world. And it's quite bleak here. Plus the fact that much of the Greek youth wants to do white collar work and not technical work, etc., but basically also very interested in modern technology and computers. But they're not staying in Greece, and they don't want to. They have no trust on the Greek political system, and from that point of view, they are right. And then there's another category of the Greek youth that is being maintained by their parents. So we're in this vicious circle, which is difficult to get out of with today's financial circumstances that prevail in Greece. So we are trying to convince them, but we're not successful for the moment.
Bob, I'd like to ask you, because one of the problems in agriculture is that with family farmers, the young people are moving off the farms, and you actually lose an incredible capability when young people are no longer brought in, because you can't really take someone and give them a university education who knows nothing about farming. It's a much more difficult thing. Do you have some thoughts on this? I know you have an idea of a million new family farmers.
Yes, well, I mean, you know, when Abraham Lincoln set in motion the Homestead Act of 1862, the U.S. government had all this land. And so he created a mechanism through credit, through the Transcontinental Railroad, to launch projects to get people out to the land. And today we have an interesting situation where we have tremendous numbers of older farmers retiring with nobody to take over the land. And it's interesting because I just read a statistic in Iowa. 80% of the farmland in Iowa is debt-free. And they just sold a farm for $25,000 an acre. So this is all being manipulated now under the current process by the banking system as another mechanism. But one of the things we could do is we need a government program where you could get the older farmers to participate in a process to set up a new farmer, a young guy, and that older farmer should get some special tax breaks, because it's a major situation. It's like saving the nation 50 years from now. And we should set up a parity pricing system so that when people participate in that program of setting up 1 million new farmers, that they're going to be getting a parity price. That means the farmer as well as the young farmer. And that's going to be a huge incentive for all the farmers to want to participate, because it's going to be providing the kind of prices, and at the same time put in the Glass-Steagall or put in the bust up these monopolies that are controlling the prices. And if the farmers got parity, you'd probably see the food prices in the grocery stores go down, because you're going to eliminate all the rip-off by the monopoly interfaces between the producer and the consumer. And I think you would see whole communities excel with that kind of a process. And I think that's in line with the idea of what we used to call what our nation was founded on. And that's an idea.
Okay, Geoff, again, we're taking up the question of inspiring youth to build the future. And that gets at the whole question that Helga posed of what do we have to do to get a mobilization to get these economic reforms implemented? So Geoff, and then Diane, since the question was directed to you, I'll let you take it next. Go ahead, Geoff.
I yield my time.
Okay. Diane?
Okay. I saw Jim had his hand up, and one thing that he said earlier is the question of hope for young people, which is crucial. But I would say first we have to stop torturing the younger generation. They are saddled with debt, with this green ideology. You're telling children that they are nothing more than a carbon footprint, and they're just destroying the atmosphere, and they can't possibly expect, like Barack Obama told the people in South Africa, that don't all you people think you're going to have air conditioning and electricity. You're going to boil the planet over. So there's been a very pessimistic, zero growth, negative growth idea imposed upon younger generations about what the future is. So I think we have to have a much bolder image of what the future should be. For example, the United States should be building entirely new cities, science cities, cultural centers, new symphony orchestras in our new science cities. There should be something which is forward-looking. I think I had a chance to do some petitioning on campuses and actually found that the young people I met there, this was in Buffalo and Binghamton, were actually quite optimistic. And that was, I was quite relieved to see that the optimism hadn't been crushed out of them. But if they're going to graduate with a zillion dollars of debt and then work in a Wawa for, a convenience store, for people who don't know what that is, for $15 an hour or something, what's the point? So the things that really matter to human beings tend to be in what you might call the spiritual domain or the thought domain, as opposed to the physical domain, the things that we consider so it's in your hand, you can touch it, actually are the things that are transient, where the principles are immortal. So I think we have to fight in that realm. Now, on the more abrupt side of things, perhaps we should shut down Amazon for a few weeks so people realize that you cannot order something on the computer and have it show up mystically on your doorstep. There's a whole process involved in that. Maybe we should shut down the social media and ban text messages for a couple of weeks and help people to realize that they live in a universe with actual physical principles and not a cyber world.
And Helga, I'm going to give you the last word on this, but from this, we have a comment from Gail, who's a longtime supporter, who said, Helga's idea to train youth worldwide for healthcare jobs, building hospitals, medical centers, and so on, great opportunity for youth, also to work with the building of infrastructure, agriculture, and water projects. So Helga, what do you think?
Well, I would welcome if there are, in this process, there would be a lot of young people who would volunteer to either help build up agriculture in Africa or health systems in other countries of the so-called global south. I mean, people should actually, step forward, because there are a lot of older farmers who would like to help the developing countries to set up modern agriculture. So any such initiative is very welcomed. I mean, there is the dimension that people are so freaked out about China, systemic competitor, but then I said many times, if the West continues to do what they are doing, you don't need China. You are undoing yourself. Look at the mass shootings. Look at the drug legalization. A country which legalizes drugs basically gives up the mind of the young generation. I was in China, and I asked a lot of young students, what do you want to do, when you finished with your studies? And people said, I want to be astronomer. I want to go to help to build up Africa. And they made a poll, not in China, but here, where they asked the same number of 15-year-old what they want to become when they are, taking a job. The number one position in the West, actually in the United States, was influencer. In the number one position in China was astronaut. And here you see the difference. One is a serious science and, trying to grasp physical principles of our universe and go out and discover the universe, which is a whole exciting new world which you can conquer. Influenza, it means nothing. So I think if the competition between the systems is supposed to, be an incentive, then, the governments would do something like Roosevelt's CCC program. And, if that is not coming from the governments right now, that is why we created the Committee of Coincidence of Opposites, and that effort is still going on. If people are interested in collaborating with these projects, please contact us, because, it is very much urgent. So I think in concluding my remarks, I would say, this question of the identity, which came up several times in the discussion, I think that is something one should start with, because once you have a noble image of humanity, of, the absolute sacredness of the human being, the limitless self-perfectibility of human creativity, and then you have a completely different respect, and you can tell the Klaus Schwabs of this world, who in this recent book actually said that the desire of people to overcome poverty is exactly what destroys the planet. Therefore, naturally, the more people are poor, the better for the planet. And that is really the thing which makes people pessimistic. But I think the identity of man, the absolute positive idea of the human being as the only creative species, I think, that is really what must be at the beginning. And then I think it's very useful if everybody very personally says, what is the world I want to contribute to become? Don't just live from one day in the next and think about, how you get your vacation and this and that, but think about, what should mankind become? I mean, we discussed so much today about the danger of the extinction of the human species, which is a real possibility until we have this war danger overcome. But, humanity is in a real crisis, and we in the West are in such a cultural, moral crisis that, it is not certain where the West will be. It can very well be that we will become a relic in the museum of Mongolia, where they will show relics of Germans who said, that they want to go out of nuclear energy, they want to get rid of fossil energies, and then they will destroy the beautiful landscape of Germany with all these horrible windmills. But then the economy collapses and Germany disappears, and there will be only an artifact in a museum in the end. That is not something we should accept. I, for my part, want that Germany becomes again the people of the poets and thinkers, And I think everybody should have a personal vision of what you want the world to be when you have concluded your life. You know, what have you contributed, which makes humanity immortal?
I think that's a good place to stop. One of the most important things that I always point to is that the role of the people who are trying to continue the status quo, to continue to keep people in the dark, is to depress them, to keep them, to take away their optimism and hope. And we opened this panel with the spiritual, keep your hand on the plow and hold on. The idea that you can always find a solution, you never give up. And I think that at this point in time, as someone just said, this is a moment of, I think Jim said, it's a moment of opportunity. So I'd like to thank all the panelists, everyone who's watching today. Share the videos of the earlier panel and this one. They're available at the schillerinstitute.com. And we'll begin tomorrow's session on the science for the new economy, for the new economic development. We'll start at 9 a.m. at schillerinstitute.com. So with that, thank you and goodbye.